To sack. Then we're home to England. Clear the room.
Kings did not just use force to stay in power. They had tricks to keep people loyal, afraid, and too busy to fight back. By controlling what people believed, feared, and focused on, rulers made sure no one questioned who was really in charge, and most never did. In medieval villages, questioning the king's authority was met with immediate backlash. A peasant who wondered why one man ruled over all might receive a swift strike from a priest's staff, a clear reminder that such thoughts were considered blasphemous and a challenge to the divine order. This interaction captured the essence of how medieval kings controlled their populations. The ruler wasn't merely a person wearing elaborate clothing and a crown. He was supposedly chosen by God himself to lead. Throughout the Middle Ages, monarchs built their entire power structure around the divine right concept. This clever manipulation transformed ordinary men into untouchable rulers whose decisions couldn't be questioned without challenging divine will itself. Kings reinforced their authority by claiming divine selection, a notion eagerly supported by church officials. Disobedience wasn't just defying the throne, it was defying the heavens. This belief served as the ultimate protection against rebellion, ensuring that peasants who considered uprising feared not only punishment on earth, but also eternal damnation. What made this trick so effective was its brilliant simplicity. Medieval peasants, deeply religious and largely uneducated, had no way to verify these divine claims. The church, which controlled access to salvation, reinforced these royal assertions at every Sunday sermon. Some particularly crafty kings took the divine charade even further by staging miracles to prove their heavenly selection. One monarch allowed peasants to touch his royal garments, convincing them his clothes had healing powers. During coronation ceremonies, birds might be secretly released at the perfect moment, making it appear that heaven itself was celebrating the new ruler. This manipulation went beyond mere theater. Kings used their divine appointment to justify military campaigns that sent thousands to their deaths and harsh punishments for minor offenses. After all, how could God's chosen representative ever be wrong? What's truly fascinating is how long this trick worked. For nearly 1,000 years, generations of Europeans lived and died, never questioning this basic assumption about their kings. The divine right doctrine remained a cornerstone of European monarchy until the Enlightenment finally challenged it centuries later. One peasant reportedly spent 3 months in a dungeon, suggesting that perhaps God is too busy to care who sits on our throne. When released, he spent years performing extra religious duties to cleanse his sinful thoughts. The true genius of the divine right hoax wasn't just keeping peasants obedient, it turned the oppressed into defenders of their own subjugation. Peasants would silence criticism against the crown, fearing divine punishment if they didn't. Some even reported neighbors for speaking against the monarch, believing they performed a sacred duty. The divine right trick extended well beyond basic governance. Court ceremonies were designed to reinforce the king's special status. The monarch might eat alone while others watched, suggesting even his meals were sacred affairs. Royal bedchambers were treated as holy spaces with elaborate rituals for waking the king that mimicked religious ceremonies. One ruler insisted his feet never touch bare ground, as his body was too sacred for common dirt. Servants carried special cloths to place under his steps whenever he walked outside the castle. Another demanded that subjects avert their eyes when he passed, claiming his divine glow might blind ordinary people. Medieval kings essentially ran history's most successful public relations campaign, convincing millions they had God on speed dial. The manipulation ran even deeper in rural areas, where literacy rates were practically zero. Kings dispatched royal messengers to spread stories of divine visions supporting the monarchy. These tales described angels appearing to common folk, warning of eternal damnation for anyone questioning royal authority. During times of natural disaster, kings skillfully redirected blame. Rather than accepting responsibility for poor preparation or response, they declared these events punishment for the people's insufficient loyalty. This twisted logic meant every hardship actually strengthened royal power rather than weakening it. Some monarchs went so far as to claim they could control the weather, taking credit for sunny days while blaming storms on peasant disobedience. There's one particular drought where a king performed an elaborate ceremony and when rain came 2 weeks later, he was celebrated as having divine influence, despite the suffering that occurred during those 2 weeks. Kings didn't rule through physical force alone. They controlled the minds of their subjects by manipulating their deepest fears and most sacred beliefs. When you convinced medieval peasants that defying you meant defying God, you created control that armies alone could never achieve. But keeping subjects spiritually terrified wasn't the only trick medieval monarchs employed. When divine threats didn't produce enough obedience, rulers discovered that earthly fears worked just as effectively. Dawn breaks over a sleepy medieval town. Before the roosters finish their morning call, the royal crier appears, frantically ringing his bell in the town square. His face shows pure terror as he unfurls a scroll bearing the king's seal. Hear ye! Hear ye! By decree of the king, our scouts have spotted barbarian forces approaching from the east. All able men must contribute to strengthen our defenses. The king requires additional resources to protect us all. The townspeople exchange worried glances. Again, this marks the third imminent attack this year, yet no barbarians have ever materialized. Still, fear spreads quickly through the crowd as mothers clutch their children and merchants hurry to secure their goods. Medieval kings mastered this second manipulative trick, manufacturing fear of outside threats to maintain control over their populations. Whether it was Vikings, Mongols, rival kingdoms, or completely fabricated enemies, nothing united people behind a ruler quite like shared terror. What made this tactic particularly effective was how difficult it was to verify these claims. The average medieval peasant never traveled more than 10 miles from their birthplace throughout their entire life. Their knowledge of the world beyond their village came exclusively from authorities they were conditioned to trust. If the king's messenger claimed barbarians waited just beyond the horizon, who could prove otherwise? The fear tactic served multiple purposes. First, it justified increased resource extraction from an already impoverished population. Towns would surrender food reserves, building materials, and precious metals to fund defenses against enemies that often existed only in royal proclamations. There's one ruler who warned of an invasion force sailing from across the sea. The emergency defense tax collected enough resources to build 3 new castles, all conveniently located on royal lands, far from any coastline actually vulnerable to attack. When the invasion never materialized, the king simply claimed his military preparations had successfully deterred the enemy. These convenient royal victories against invisible enemies might be history's earliest example of solving problems that never actually existed. Second, manufactured fear distracts from domestic problems. When harvests failed or disease spread through villages, rulers would rather blame foreign saboteurs than address their own governance failures. By redirecting anger toward outsiders, kings prevented peasants from questioning those truly responsible for their suffering. Archaeological evidence from medieval settlements reveals fascinating insights into this manipulation. Town walls often faced unnecessary expansion and reinforcement during periods when historical records show no actual military threats existed. These construction projects served primarily as visible symbols of the supposed danger lurking beyond, and as public works projects that kept the population busy and focused on external threats rather than internal grievances. The fear tactic worked because it tapped into the basic human need for protection. Medieval life carried enough real dangers without imaginary ones: disease, famine, harsh winters. Kings positioned themselves as the only barrier between their subjects and certain doom, making obedience seem not just necessary, but desirable. Medieval rulers became experts at defending their kingdoms against enemy armies that conveniently never seemed to arrive. Most effective was how this trick created self-perpetuating loyalty. The more a population feared outside threats, the more they depended on their ruler for safety, regardless of whether the danger was real. Medieval chronicles describe entire villages performing gratitude ceremonies for kings who protected them from invasions that never occurred. One fascinating account from a medieval monk describes how a rural community spent 15 years building elaborate defenses against a supposedly savage tribe from the mountains. The defensive fortifications were never tested because the tribe didn't exist, yet the community celebrated their king annually for keeping them safe from this imaginary threat. Researchers estimate that as much as 20% of medieval castle construction served no practical defensive purpose, instead functioning primarily as visible symbols of threat and protection. These unnecessary fortifications consumed enormous resources that could have improved living conditions for common people. While divine authority convinced medieval people that questioning the king was blasphemy, manufactured fear made them believe loyalty to the crown was their only path to survival. Together, these two tricks created subjects who were both spiritually and physically dependent on their rulers. But kings understood that constant terror would eventually wear thin. Sometimes a different approach was needed. Kings understood something very important about their people. A well-fed, entertained peasant was less likely to pick up a pitchfork and start asking questions. When life was nothing but backbreaking labor, heavy taxes, and the occasional famine, people needed something to distract them. And that is where festivals came in. At first glance, these celebrations seemed like generous gifts from the crown. Days filled with feasts, music, and games, a break from the grinding misery of daily life. But festivals were more than just fun. They were carefully planned tools of control, ensuring that the peasants remained obedient while thinking they were being rewarded. Give people just enough joy to keep them from realizing how miserable they are. A strategy so effective, even modern workplaces still use it. One of the most effective distractions was the sheer amount of drinking involved. Ale flowed freely, sometimes even provided by the ruling class. Peasants drank until their problems felt far away, conveniently forgetting that those problems would still be waiting when the festival ended. It was a simple formula. Taxes took their money, festivals took their sobriety, and by the time they recovered, they were too exhausted to rebel. Competitions were another essential part of these events. Archery contests, wrestling matches, and games of skill gave commoners a rare chance to prove themselves. The reward? Sometimes it was a prize, but more often it was just the thrill of victory. And that thrill kept people invested in the system. If a peasant won a contest and was praised by the local lord, it created the illusion that status was flexible, that talent, not birth, determined one's place. Of course, the moment the festival ended, that same peasant went right back to working the fields. But for a brief moment, they could pretend they mattered. Entertainment was just as important as food and drink. Minstrels, jesters, and performers filled the streets, keeping people occupied with music and comedy. Some of the jokes even made fun of the nobility, but only in ways that were safe. A king might allow a fool to joke about his bad breath, but not about his bad policies. Mocking the ruler's fashion choices? Hilarious. Mocking his tax policies? Treason. Then there were the tournaments. While peasants enjoyed their drinking contests and simple games, knights clashed in grand battles, putting on a spectacular show. These tournaments reinforced the idea that war was noble, that knights were heroes, and that the entire feudal system was a natural order. The reality? Most knights were just well-paid enforcers for the crown, but as long as the peasants were dazzled by the sight of armored warriors clashing in the arena, they did not stop to think about who those warriors actually served. Of course, not all festivals were about joy. Some had a darker purpose, public executions disguised as entertainment. A criminal or a political opponent conveniently labeled as one would be brought before the crowd, and the people were encouraged to cheer as justice was served. These events reinforced royal authority, reminding everyone what happened to those who stepped out of line. It was the medieval equivalent of a public service announcement: crime does not pay. But watching the punishment, that's free. Kings also knew how to use festivals to manipulate emotions. If taxes had been raised recently, a festival was the perfect way to keep people from complaining too much. If a war had gone badly, a grand celebration could turn attention away from the losses and focus on glorious sacrifice. And if the harvest had been terrible, well, at least there was still ale. These events served another purpose as well, draining the peasants' energy. After days of feasting and celebrating, people were too tired, too hungover, or too distracted to think about rebellion. By the time they returned to their daily routines, they had lost whatever anger or frustration they might have had. It was a cycle that repeated year after year, keeping society stable, at least from the king's perspective. And when festivals were not enough, the rulers had other tricks. The most reliable trick of all, keeping them too broke to complain. The medieval peasant did not need to wonder where their money was going. They already knew. It was going straight into the pockets of the king, the nobles, and anyone else who decided they deserved a cut. The tax system was not just unfair, It was a masterpiece of never-ending payments, ensuring that peasants could never truly get ahead. And just when people thought they had paid their dues, another tax appeared, as if by magic. A magic trick so good it is still being performed today. Everything had a price. There was a tax for farming the land, a tax for using the mill, a tax for getting married, and even a tax for simply existing. If someone owned a cow, they paid a tax. If they had a chimney, they paid a tax. If they breathed too confidently, they probably paid a tax for that too. The idea was simple. No matter how hard peasants worked, they would never have enough to challenge the system. The worst part? The rules could change at any moment. A peasant might scrape together just enough to survive, only to wake up and find that a new tax had been invented overnight. Maybe the king needed more gold for a war, or a noble had decided that walking on a certain road should cost extra. It was a lot like playing a game where the rules change every 5 minutes, and the only guaranteed outcome is losing. Wars were one of the best excuses for raising taxes. If a king wanted to invade a neighboring land, he could not just ask politely for money, he had to take it. So he declared a war tax, claiming it was necessary for protection. Even when the war ended, the tax often did not. Because what ruler would ever turn down free money? Some taxes lasted for generations, long after the original reason for them had been forgotten. The church was no stranger to this system either. Tithes were required. 1/10 of a peasant's earnings went straight to the church. In theory, this money helped the poor, but in reality, much of it ended up funding massive cathedrals and ensuring that church leaders lived comfortably. It was a perfect setup. Pay now and maybe receive blessings later. Maybe, but if a peasant somehow managed to avoid these taxes, that was considered a crime. Tax evasion was not just frowned upon, it could mean severe punishment. Lords sent tax collectors to enforce payments, and those who could not pay faced brutal consequences. If they were lucky, they only lost their livestock. If they were unlucky, they lost their freedom. Debt in medieval times was not a financial inconvenience. It was a direct path to becoming a servant for life. And for those who thought they could avoid the system by hiding their earnings, there were always informants. Some rulers encouraged people to report their neighbors for tax evasion in exchange for rewards. This meant that peasants could not even trust each other, as anyone could be tempted to turn them in. There is nothing like forced betrayal to keep a population too busy watching each other to unite against their real problem. One of the most ridiculous taxes in history was the window tax. In certain places, people were taxed based on the number of windows in their homes. The logic? More windows meant more wealth. The result? People started sealing up their windows to avoid paying. If medieval tax policies had continued, fresh air might have ended up as a luxury. Even after death, the payments did not stop. Some rulers charged inheritance taxes, ensuring that families could not even pass down what little they had without giving a portion to the crown. Dying was not an escape. It was just another taxable event. This system guaranteed that power remained exactly where it was. The nobility lived in luxury, the church maintained its influence, and the peasants continued to struggle. The endless cycle of payments kept people trapped in survival mode, too busy working to ever challenge the system. But money alone was not enough to keep everyone in line. The kings needed another trick. A king could not tax his people into the ground all at once. That would cause problems. A desperate peasant might accept their suffering, but a peasant with nothing left to lose was dangerous. That is why medieval rulers mastered the art of fake generosity, lowering taxes just enough to make people grateful before raising them again when no one was paying attention. A strategy so effective it still works in modern pricing tricks. Raise the cost of something, then lower it slightly and call it a discount. It started with overtaxing. The king declared an emergency, usually a war, a famine, or some vague national crisis, and raised taxes to extreme levels. The people had no choice but to pay. They grumbled, but they paid. Then, when the timing was right, the king made a grand announcement: taxes were being reduced. Suddenly, the same people who had been suffering under heavy taxation were cheering for their ruler. It was a trick that worked every time. Take too much, then give back a little, and people will thank you as if you have done them a favor. This method worked best when people had short memories. A ruler could double taxes, wait until rebellion seemed possible, then mercifully cut them down by half. The peasants, relieved, would accept their situation, forgetting that they were still paying more than they had before. It was like someone stealing 10 coins from you, then returning 3 and expecting you to be grateful for it. The nobility also played this game. Lords would raise the fees peasants owed for using mills, roads, or markets. When the backlash was strong, they would reduce them slightly and act as if they had done a great service. This kept people under control, ensuring that they believed their rulers were fair and reasonable. Meanwhile, the only real change was that the peasants' pockets were still empty, just slightly slower than before. One of the most common times kings used this trick was during wartime. A war tax was introduced, justified by the need to defend the kingdom. People paid because they had no choice. But long after the war ended, the tax remained. Then, years later, the king would finally announce that he was lowering it, presenting himself as a generous leader. Of course, by then the original tax had already made him richer than the war itself ever could. But war was not the only excuse. Some rulers introduced temporary taxes that somehow became permanent. The infamous ship tax in some places was supposed to fund the navy, but even when there were no ships to build, the tax remained. Another example was the bridge tax, meant to pay for the construction of new crossings over rivers. Decades after the bridges were built, people were still paying. At that point, they were not funding bridges. They were just funding the king's latest castle. Religious institutions were not above using the same strategy. Churches imposed tithes, claiming they were necessary to support the poor, maintain religious buildings, and serve the people. Then, when complaints grew too loud, they reduced the tithes slightly and preached gratitude. Meanwhile, the wealth of the church only grew, proving that generosity, when properly managed, could be a very profitable business. Some kings even timed their generosity with political moves. When they needed support from their people, they would lower taxes briefly, winning public favor. Once the crisis passed, the taxes quietly returned to their original levels, if not higher. It was an old trick. Be generous when people are watching, and be greedy when they are not. For those who failed to pay, the consequences were always severe. Whether the tax was high or low, skipping payments was treated as a crime. A peasant who could not pay a debt often lost everything, from their land to their freedom. Some were forced into labor, while others had their property seized. A few even ended up imprisoned or worse. For something as simple as failing to hand over enough coins, a person could go from farmer to criminal overnight. This cycle of taxation ensured that power remained firmly in the hands of the ruling class. No matter how much money was taken, people were always made to believe they were getting a fair deal. The king's generosity was an illusion, carefully crafted to keep peasants from ever realizing just how much they were being taken advantage of. But taxes and fake generosity were only part of the strategy. The real key to maintaining power was controlling something else. Medieval kings understood that knowledge was dangerous, so they made sure it stayed in the hands of those who served them. Keeping peasants illiterate was not just a side effect of their difficult lives, it was a deliberate strategy. Because a peasant who could not read could not question, and a peasant who could not question was as harmless as a well-fed pig. Reading and writing were skills reserved for the nobility, the clergy, and a few select officials. Peasants had no access to books, no schools, and no real way to learn. In some cases, it was even illegal for commoners to be educated. The reasoning was simple. If people could read, they might start asking why the king had so much while they had so little. And that was a question no ruler wanted to answer. Laws were intentionally written in ways the common folk could not understand. Royal decrees were issued in Latin or French, languages spoken only by the upper class. Even local laws, which affected peasants the most, were kept confusing and vague. If someone was accused of breaking the law, they had to rely on a noble or a priest to explain it. And let's be honest, that explanation probably included the words, "pay a fine," or "off to the dungeon with you." Books were not just rare, they were locked away. Some were literally chained to church walls, ensuring that only priests or high-ranking officials could read them. And when books were copied by hand, since the printing press had not been invented yet, they were expensive, making them impossible for ordinary people to own. If a peasant somehow got hold of a book, it was probably by accident, and they would likely trade it for something more useful, like food or firewood. Churches played a big role in keeping knowledge restricted. Since most education came from religious institutions, Priests controlled what was taught. And what was taught? Obedience, morality, and the idea that suffering in this life would lead to rewards in the next. Peasants were encouraged to accept their place and trust that their hardships were part of a divine plan. Meanwhile, the priests themselves had libraries filled with books that contained ideas too dangerous for the common folk. Even when someone managed to learn how to read, there was little they could do with that skill. Writing materials were expensive, and there were hardly any books available for them. Information was passed down orally, but that also made it easy for rulers to control the narrative. Peasants only knew what their lords and priests wanted them to know. And if the truth got a little adjusted along the way, well, who was going to argue? One of the most effective ways to keep people ignorant was by limiting their access to news from other regions. Travel was difficult, and without literacy, people could not read about events in distant lands. If another kingdom overthrew its king or fought back against unfair taxation, that information never reached the villages. Kings did not need to silence rebellious ideas if those ideas never arrived in the first place. Even the nobility had to be careful with knowledge. A well-educated noble might start questioning the king's authority, and that could lead to dangerous thoughts. Some rulers restricted education even among the wealthy, ensuring that only the most loyal subjects had access to books and advanced learning. A noble who read too much might start thinking, and a noble who thought too much might start plotting. Illiteracy ensured that power remained exactly where the king wanted it. Peasants could not write complaints, spread rebellious ideas, or even understand the laws that controlled them. They relied on those in power to interpret everything for them, making it easy to manipulate and deceive them. And if a peasant did somehow manage to challenge the system, well, that is where the church came in handy again. Anyone who questioned authority too much could be accused of heresy, a crime that had no real defense. If the choice was between ignorance and a public burning, most people wisely chose ignorance, but illiteracy alone was not enough. Kings had another trick to keep people under control. Village gatherings in medieval times weren't always festive affairs. Often, they were mandatory oath-taking ceremonies where peasants lined up one by one to swear undying loyalty to their king. The scene would unfold with solemn pageantry, royal banners fluttering in the wind, stern-faced guards watching closely, and nervous peasants shuffling forward to place their hands on religious relics. "Repeat after me," a royal official would command. "I swear by all that is holy to serve my king faithfully until death, to obey all commands without question, and to report any treasonous talk I may hear." What made these oath ceremonies particularly manipulative was that most peasants couldn't read or understand the complex legal language being used. They were effectively signing a blank contract with their words. The oaths were deliberately written with vague, open-ended terms that could be interpreted however the king wished at a later date. These medieval kings were essentially getting peasants to sign the world's worst terms of service agreement, except instead of giving away your data, you were giving away your life. Some rural communities underwent mandatory oath renewals as often as 4 times a year. Each ceremony reinforced the king's authority and reminded subjects of their binding promises. Many kings timed these ceremonies to coincide with religious festivals, blending sacred and royal authority in the minds of participants. What made this system truly insidious was the severe punishment for breaking these forced oaths. Medieval law codes treated oath-breaking as one of the most serious crimes possible, worse than theft and sometimes even murder. The reasoning was straightforward. A thief only took property, but an oath-breaker undermined the entire social order. Archaeological evidence from medieval execution sites reveals that a surprising number of people were put to death specifically for oath violations. In one excavated burial ground, researchers found that approximately 25% of executed individuals had been convicted of betraying sworn fealty, making it the second most common capital crime after murder. The penalties for breaking oaths varied by region, but were universally harsh. Common punishments included public execution, often by hanging or beheading exile, which effectively meant a death sentence in a world where strangers were deeply mistrusted, confiscation of all property and lands, imprisonment in the castle, dungeons, mutilation such as cutting off hands that had been raised during the oath. Medieval kings basically invented the terms and conditions may change at any time policy, except the penalty for violation wasn't just losing your account, it was losing your head. Perhaps the most twisted aspect of this system was its one-sided nature. While peasants faced death for breaking their forced oaths, historical facts reveal numerous instances of kings brazenly violating their own coronation oaths with zero consequences. Kings routinely promised to protect their subjects, maintain traditional rights, and rule justly, then proceeded to do exactly the opposite whenever convenient. One particularly revealing medieval court document describes a peasant who was executed for refusing to fight in a war he had technically sworn to support. At his trial, he pointed out that the king had previously sworn not to declare war without just cause and proper consultation. The judge ruled that determining just cause was the king's sole right, and the peasant was hanged the next day. The psychological impact of these forced loyalty schemes was profound. Medieval subjects lived with the constant anxiety that they might accidentally violate some aspect of their oath. This created a population that overcompensated with displays of loyalty and reported even minor complaints against the crown, anything to avoid being labeled an oath breaker. Historians have discovered that many rural villages appointed oath keepers, local officials whose job was to remind people of their sworn obligations and report any violations. These individuals became the king's eyes and ears in remote communities, turning neighbors against each other through institutionalized surveillance. The oath system was particularly effective because it exploited medieval people's deeply held religious beliefs. Swearing on holy relics or sacred texts meant invoking divine punishment for breaking one's word. Kings cleverly positioned themselves not just as the earthly enforcer of oaths, but as the representative of God's will on earth. This forced loyalty scheme created a perfect trap. Refuse to swear the oath and face immediate punishment, or swear it and live under its constant threat. Either way, the king maintained control over a population bound by words they often didn't fully understand but couldn't escape. But sometimes even the most carefully designed system of control through oaths wasn't enough. When kings needed to make examples of those who stepped out of line, they turned to an even more sinister approach. Two men stand before the king's court, both accused of the same crime, stealing a loaf of bread. The first man wears tattered clothes, his hands calloused from farm work. The second wears fine garments, a noble's ring glinting on his finger. For the crime of theft, declares the judge, the peasant shall lose his right hand and spend 5 years in the dungeon. Turning to the nobleman, the judge's tone softens. For your misunderstanding, a fine of 2 silver coins should settle the matter. This wasn't some rare miscarriage of justice in medieval times. It was the system working exactly as designed. Medieval kings mastered the art of selective punishment, creating 2 entirely different legal worlds: harsh justice for the powerless and gentle mercy for the powerful. Medieval law codes explicitly outlined different punishments based on social class. In many kingdoms, the exact same crime carried penalties that varied dramatically depending on who committed it. A survey of 13th century criminal cases shows that nobles convicted of serious crimes paid fines in 85% of cases, while commoners convicted of identical offenses faced corporal punishment or execution 90% of the time. This wasn't accidental. It was a codified policy. Medieval justice operated like a restaurant with 2 menus: the peasant menu, where every dish costs an arm and a leg, sometimes literally, and the noble menu, where everything costs pocket change. The selective punishment system served multiple purposes. First, it reinforced social hierarchy by making the consequences of breaking rules fundamentally different for each class. Nobles learned they could get away with nearly anything, while peasants learned that even minor infractions could destroy their lives. Second, it created a powerful incentive for peasants to accept unfair treatment rather than seek justice. When challenging a noble meant facing a biased court system, most commoners simply endured abuse rather than risk punishment themselves. One of the clearest examples of this manipulation was the medieval forest law system. In many kingdoms, hunting in royal forests was forbidden to commoners but permitted for nobles. A hungry peasant catching a rabbit to feed his family could face execution, while nobles hosted elaborate hunting parties in the same forest with the king's blessing. Over 400 peasants were executed for forest law violations over a 50-year period in just one county. During the same period, 0 nobles faced execution for identical offenses. When caught, nobles typically paid nominal fines or received formal warnings. The king's forest was basically medieval Europe's most deadly petting zoo, at least if you were poor. The absurdity of selective punishment extended to all aspects of life. A nobleman who killed a commoner might pay a small fine called vergild, essentially a murder fee, while a commoner who accidentally injured a nobleman could face torture or execution. Medieval law literally put a price on human life, with nobles valued as much as 30 times higher than peasants. Even speaking carried different risks depending on social status. Court transcripts show cases where peasants were severely punished for disrespectful language, while nobles routinely used the same words without consequence. What made the system particularly effective was how openly it operated. Kings didn't hide the double standard. They celebrated it as proper and natural. Royal proclamations and church teachings reinforced the message that different classes deserved different treatment, making injustice seem like divine order. The psychological impact was profound. Peasants internalized the idea that they deserved harsh punishment, while nobles came to view leniency as their birthright. This created a society where the oppressed often defended the very system that oppressed them. For medieval kings, justice wasn't blind. It was carefully calibrated to maintain power. While forced oaths bound peasants to obedience through sacred promises, selective punishment ensured that breaking those oaths carried consequences only for those without power or connections. But medieval kings understood that controlling people required more than just punishment. Sometimes the most effective manipulation involved giving peasants the illusion of choice while ensuring the outcome was predetermined. This led to perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated royal trick of all. Have you ever felt like your choices aren't really choices at all? Medieval peasants certainly understood that feeling. Welcome to one of history's most clever manipulations, the fake choice trick. Picture a village square filled with anxious peasants. The king's messenger announces wonderful news. His Majesty, in his infinite wisdom, will allow you to select your next tax collector. Your choices are the duke's cousin, the baron's son, or the king's nephew. The crowd murmurs with confusion. Is this really a choice at all? Medieval kings mastered the art of offering carefully constructed choices that created the illusion of freedom while ensuring outcomes already decided by the crown. This psychological manipulation was remarkably effective at making peasants feel invested in decisions they had no real power to influence. Court documents from medieval Europe reveal numerous examples of these sham elections and consultations. A 14th century French province describes a town election where peasants could vote for one of 3 candidates, all of whom were related to the royal treasurer and committed to implementing the same tax increase. Medieval democracy was like being asked if you wanted to be executed by sword, axe, or arrow. Technically a choice, but none of the options involved staying alive. The fake choice trick took many forms. Sometimes kings would allow villages to select their local officials from a pre-approved list of nobles loyal to the crown. Other times they would consult with peasant representatives about new laws, after those laws had already been written and sealed with the royal stamp. Historical evidence suggests this manipulation was shockingly effective. Town meetings show that peasants often vigorously debated these false choices, fighting passionately over which pre-selected noble would rule them or which method of taxation would drain their resources. One medieval chronicle describes a village that spent 3 days in heated argument over which of the king's 2 cousins should become their new lord, unaware that both candidates had already agreed to implement identical policies that would double the village's tribute to the crown. The psychological power of fake choices comes from a simple truth about human nature. People who believe they've participated in a decision feel more invested in the outcome, even when their participation was meaningless. Medieval kings exploited this principle masterfully. By giving peasants the appearance of input without the substance, they created subjects who felt personally responsible for decisions that had been made for them. This false sense of agency made resistance less likely and compliance more willing. These kings were running a political magic show where peasants thought they picked the card, but the deck was stacked the whole time. One clever monarch reveals a systematic approach to fake choices. When introducing a new tax, royal officials would present 3 options to village elders: a very high tax, an impossibly high tax, or a moderately high tax. When the elders inevitably chose the reasonable option, they would return to their villages feeling they had secured a victory, unaware that the moderate rate was exactly what the king had planned to collect all along. Archaeological evidence adds another dimension to our understanding of this manipulation. Excavations of medieval village meeting halls have uncovered voting tokens and rudimentary ballot boxes, suggesting elaborate performances of democracy in communities that had no real political power. These artifacts reveal the extent to which kings invested in maintaining the illusion of choice. The fake choice trick extended beyond politics into justice and daily life. Accused criminals might be offered the choice between confession with a lighter sentence or maintaining innocence and facing torture, a choice designed to extract confessions regardless of guilt. Village disputes would be settled by neutral judges who happened to be appointed by and loyal to the local lord. What made this manipulation particularly effective was how it co-opted natural leaders. Kings would identify influential peasants and give them minor roles in the decision-making theater, effectively turning potential resistance leaders into unwitting agents of the very system that oppressed them. While selective punishment created fear through unequal justice, the fake choice trick worked by manufacturing consent. Together, these two tactics ensured that medieval kings maintained control not just through force, but through sophisticated psychological manipulation that remains relevant even today. But sometimes, even fake choices weren't enough to prevent new ideas from threatening the established order. Kings needed a more fundamental method to suppress dangerous thinking that might lead to real change. A peasant stands nervously before the village council, holding a crude wooden model of his invention, a modified plow that could till twice the land in half the time. Instead of excitement, his innovation is met with suspicious glares and whispered accusations of witchcraft. By sunset, his workshop had been searched, his prototype destroyed, and his family warned about the dangers of unnatural thinking. This scene played out countless times across medieval Europe, reflecting the final and perhaps most fundamental trick medieval kings used to control their populations, systematically suppressing innovation and change. Medieval rulers understood that new ideas threatened the established order. A society that embraced change might question why kings ruled in the first place. The solution? Create a culture where innovation was not just discouraged, but actively feared. Historical facts reveal how thoroughly this anti-innovation mindset was embedded in medieval society. Court documents from the period show that people who introduced new farming techniques, unfamiliar tools, or foreign concepts faced serious accusations ranging from heresy to witchcraft. One rural inventor who designed an improved water wheel was fined for attempting to interfere with God's established order of labor. The kings had a simple philosophy about new ideas. If it wasn't done in grandfather's time, it probably deserved a stint in the dungeon. Kings enforced this fear of change through multiple channels. Religious authorities taught that God had established the proper way to do everything, and deviation was sinful pride. Legal codes imposed harsh penalties for abandoning traditional methods. Social pressure made innovators into outcasts, with neighbors shunning anyone who seemed too clever for their own good. The suppression extended beyond technology to social ideas. Historical accounts describe villagers being punished for suggesting alternative ways to organize harvest labor or distribute communal resources. One medieval chronicle mentions a farmer who proposed rotating village leadership positions instead of having hereditary village elders. He was publicly flogged for promoting dangerous foreign notions. Perhaps the most revealing evidence comes from sumptuary laws, strict regulations controlling what different social classes could wear, eat, and own. These laws went beyond mere displays of wealth. They criminalized any attempt by lower classes to adopt the customs, speech patterns, or knowledge associated with their betters. Peasants caught wearing clothes above their station could face harsher punishment than one caught stealing food. A remarkable case from the 15th century describes a merchant fined an entire year's profit for using certain phrases considered noble speech in public documents. While nobles called it maintaining tradition, peasants called it the original dress code violation, with penalties slightly worse than detention, more like detention for life. The psychological impact of this systematic suppression was profound. Medieval communities developed a deep-seated conservatism where people automatically rejected unfamiliar ideas without consideration. Innovation became associated with danger, punishment, and social rejection, a connection that served royal interests perfectly. What made this manipulation particularly effective was how it became self-enforcing. Kings didn't need to personally suppress every new idea. They created a culture where communities policed themselves, with ordinary people shutting down innovation before it could spread. By making change itself the enemy, medieval kings protected their power from the greatest threat of all, the possibility that people might imagine a different way to live. While fake choices controlled present decisions, the fear of change ensured the future would remain safely under royal control. These 10 manipulative tricks created a system of control more durable than any castle wall. They show that medieval kings understood something crucial about power. Controlling what people believe is far more effective than controlling what they do.